Hey folks, quick update before we dive in. Exciting news, I've officially joined the Lions of Liberty Network, and that means even more liberty-loving content coming your way. You'll still get new episodes of The Brian Nichols Show right here every Monday and Friday, but now every Thursday I'm dropping a brand new show exclusively on the Lions of Liberty RSS feed and channels. And then every other week, I'm joining Brian McWilliams, John Odermatt, and new addition Lou Perez for Politics, our no-holds-barred roundup of current events and the bloodsuckers in D.C. It's politics with a bite. All right, now let's jump into today's episode of The Brian Nichols Show.
And alternately, you can have all the institutional power in the world, but if you can't organize people to accomplish common goals, you can't move the organization forward, you're not leading. Doesn't matter how much power you have. I think both sides of the aisle, frankly, really could stand to be reminded of that. When people ask me, who's your favorite political leader? I'm like, do you mean currently? Because we're going to be here a while.
Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show. Well, hey there, folks. Brian Nichols here on another fun-filled episode of The Brian Nichols Show. Yes, I am, as always, your humble host, joining you from our lovely Cardio Miracle Studios here in Eastern Indiana. The Brian Nichols Show is powered by Cardio Miracle, the best heart health supplement in the world. If you want to learn more about how to lower that resting heart rate, lower your blood pressure while improving your pump at the gym, stick around. We're going to talk about that more later in today's episode. But first, we're digging into all things free speech, censorship from the government, and a microcosm looking at the colleges and universities who are fighting back. That's the question. And joining me today to discuss all that and more is Aaron Pomerantz. Aaron, welcome to the Brian Nichols Show. How you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Great to have you. I'm looking forward to digging into this conversation because elephant in the room, I'm hearing from folks all over the political spectrum who are, I would say have that TDS, right? The Trump derangement syndrome. They're freaking out. They're saying, oh my gosh, the government's trying to censor all of these different colleges and universities. They're trying to stop our taxpayer dollars from going to them, even though they're private institutions. There's a lot to dig in here, Aaron. But before we do that, do us a favor. Introduce yourself here to the Brian Nichols Show audience, and I guess specifically where your focus of research lies.
Yeah, so I'm a social psychologist and researcher. I work at Rice University, which is, I believe one of the colleges that's being mentioned right now in terms of are we a problem or not. My work is specifically in leader development. I work to figure out how we can use psychological principles and other interdisciplinary focuses to develop college students into better leaders. And instead of just the focus of education thus far has very much been on imparting knowledge, but traditionally there was actually a lot more about it than that. We were about making people into better people who can go out and make a difference in the world, as trite as that sometimes sounds. So my research focuses both on that, and then when leadership goes wrong, how do we stop it? And how do we understand how leadership goes wrong? So I have one sphere of research for my happy days when I want to feel sad, and then one sphere of research for my sad days when I want to feel happy.
Well, I want to just really quick before we dig into today's topic of conversation, because I do think they actually go hand in hand, is that leadership side of things, right? You look at any political entity, you look at any government, you look at any business, right? It really, the success of that business does stem from the top. And I know there's this very, I'm not going to call it a left-wing perspective, but you definitely hear this echoed more in that camp of, it's so sad that the workers only get paid X% of the leadership. And then the response usually is, I'd love to see that McDonald's minimum wage employee be the CEO of the company, right? There's a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of, a lot that doesn't get seen behind the scene, or rather from behind the scenes in that public facing area. And a lot of it is not so much the written down spoken stuff. It's the leadership. I've seen this as I've gone through it. I've coached and consulted with different entities in the B2B space for sales, for example. And if you have a company that's not from a leadership perspective, focused on actual, growth, sales, like that kind of mentality, then there's going to be a a lagging from the people you hire, from the sales folks you hire. We call them the difference between hunters, and I call them zoo bears, right? You have a bear, it's in the wild, goes out, it kills the food it wants to eat, right? Zoo bears, they sit there, they're fat, they're happy, they get fed the food. They don't have to go out and hunt it. And if you see that an organization who they live by getting new sales for that new pipeline and that new revenue, if they have a sales team that's been enabled and built up by a leadership that incentivizes zoobearism, right? The entity is going to die. You need to have that hunter mentality. And I see this, it really does stem down from leadership. So let's just really quickly talk about leadership, because I think that overarching theme is going to play very much into not just, the conversation we're going to have today, but I think it's going to get the wheels turning for folks in terms of, what organizations are we supporting? Not if we just like the grassroots, base level employees, but really let's move upstream to see what their leadership's doing. So talk to us about that, Aaron. Talk to us more about that leadership mentality.
Well, again, kind of like what you said, leadership is not just about, inhabiting a space. So it's not like you could just move somebody from the ranks, as it were, into the C-suite, or, whatever model you're using, whether it's the White House, the C-suite, I don't know what they call the president's office in academia. I've been here for 10 years, but the academic C-suite. You can't just move people into those roles. It's not about role inhabitants. It's not about being in a space. It is really about casting a vision, as hippie as that sounds in some ways. Like, being a leader, an effective leader, is about vision. It's not just about having power. Like, I ask this of people in my work sometimes. I'm like, okay, does just having power make you a leader? Would you describe that? Just having that power making somebody a leader? Well, no, it's how you use it. You can be in a situation where you actually don't have much institutional power. You don't have much formal in the situation that's letting you hire and fire people, and you can still be a leader. And alternately, you can have all the institutional power in the world, but if you can't organize people to accomplish common goals, you can't move the organization forward, you're not leading. Doesn't matter how much power you have. I think both sides of the aisle, frankly, really could stand to be reminded of that. When people ask me, who's your favorite political leader? I'm like, do you mean currently? Because we're going to be here a while. I'll just be very blunt, like you said about this current issue. I'm like, there are very few good leaders, at least on the political side of this, that I can look to and recommend people follow their style here. I'm not going to recommend Harry Reid's, just keep your head down and, the anti-Semitism will be fine. I'm also not going to advocate for Donald Trump's Art of the Deal, which, in addition to being a book he probably didn't write, is just hundreds of pages saying, if you bully people enough, that's leadership. I think we've seen in the last 4 months alone how well that works. Leadership is about actually being effective. And I think that's a question nobody's really asking here. Is like, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? What's the best way to do that? And if you're a leader, sometimes that means taking yourself and your ego out of the equation. It doesn't mean you have to be the hero. That's the great man theory of leadership. I know a lot of people on the right are really in love with that. I've been, let's just say, accosted a little bit when I say I don't believe in it. And they're like, well, you don't believe you have anything to learn from studying George Washington. I'm like, I didn't say that. But if you're saying that I'm going to try to emulate him, like take a hammer to my teeth and, grow another foot because I'm short and move to Virginia, like, what's that going to do for me? I'm not going to ever inhabit the space he inhabited. What it is about effectiveness. So maybe, think a little bit less about trying to emulate a specific person and more about what you want to accomplish in this very specific situation you find yourself in as a leader.
I'm really glad, by the way, Aaron, you keep on using the word effectiveness, because that's exactly the stuff I care about when I'm doing sales coaching, or I'm going into an organization and helping them restructure their go-to-market strategies from a sales perspective, right? Because I hear what you're doing, and then there is what you need to do, right? And I know the what you need to do based on what I've seen work at other organizations from an effectiveness standpoint. And I think back to one of my first sales jobs. It was a technology company, and my job was an account executive, where you're not just focused on trying to close one new business for new revenue, but you're also responsible in this case, because it was a smaller, like an SMB, you're responsible for building new pipeline, which means you have to go out and curate new opportunities. How do you do that, right? Well, you can go knock on doors, you can shake hands, go to networking events, or you do the hard part, which is actually smile and dial. You sit down, you get a list of folks that are ICPs, your ideal customer personas, within a specific vertical, right? So you now you're laser focusing there. You've outlined your buyer persona. I know I'm selling to this person in this type of a vertical, and I know that this is usually a good fit. And then you establish your talk track. You're asking great questions. You're doing what I call warm calling. And I went to this organization and I started. I was an account executive, and there was about 4 or 5 other account executives, and they were much like I mentioned earlier, those zoo bears, right? They would sit there, we'll hit the dial button. We'll see if we get some folks. And I came in, I was just different. And that just, if folks have been watching now for 970 episodes of the show, they know I'm a little different. And in that mentality, I just sat down and I had my list and I just went to town, and I had 3 appointments set that first day just by doing the hard work. And they're like, dude, why are you doing this? Like, what you're making us look bad. And I'm like, well, because it doesn't matter. I'm not here just for a job. I'm not just here for a paycheck. I'm here to be effective, right? And I'm going to do the things that, the A plus B needs to equal C. So if I'm looking at my outputs and I'm not getting C, I might need to adjust A, right? And in this case, it was, you have to do the things that actually lead to new pipeline. Here's how I'm going to tie this to what our conversation is today, Aaron. Like, when I look at a lot of folks in the political world, there is the ideal versus the reality, what actually works, right? And this is where I get so frustrated with both folks on the left and the right, because you have these thought leaders, you have these talking heads who will go on to everybody's favorite MSM organization, right? And they'll spout their narrative. But when your average person actually digests that, they sit back and they say, is this narrative effective? Not just from a persuasion and messaging standpoint, but from actually making my life better. Throughout today's episode, we've been hammering home the idea of effectiveness, how leadership isn't about talking loud or looking busy. It's about delivering real results. Well, that's exactly why I've been using Cardio Miracle for the past 2 years. Not because some influencer told me to, or because it's got a flashy label, but because it works. My blood pressure's down, my energy's up, and I can hit the gym like I'm 10 years younger, which as you get into your 30s, you really want. So if you want real, not performative, Cardio Miracle is your answer. Nitric oxide boosting, heart helping, feel better daily kind of real. And tariffs might be a blunt instrument for change, but when it comes to your heart health, you want precision. You want something that's fine-tuned for results, not rhetoric. So, if you're tired of trusting Big Pharma's version of leadership, give Cardio Miracle a try. Head to cardiomiracle.com and use code TBNS at checkout to get 15% off your order, or just scan that little QR code over my shoulder. One more time, that is code TBNS for 15% off your order. Let's make your heart health effective again with Cardio Miracle. And now, let's get back to the show. Tangibly, no. We're seeing that right now. A lot of folks are saying, no, you can talk a good game, but at the end of the day, what really matters is the results. What I, as the voter, or in this case, the buyer, am getting from the folks that I'm putting into positions of leadership. And this is where I think today's conversation can really, it can really grow, because we see this across the board with our friends on the left and the right. If you talk louder, right? You're the squeakiest wheel. You're going to get the cameras on you. You can promote your narrative, but your average person starting to say, and that's not enough. And by the way, I would dare say, Aaron, I want to hear your thoughts on this. That's partly why I think Trump got his second chance with, I know some folks argue about the word mandate, but I would say from a political standpoint, relative to what we experienced over the 4 years prior, it was somewhat of a mandate, especially a cultural shift, right? But I would say that a lot of that came back to the Biden administration, the Democratic Party. They were promoting this very, very strong narrative of DEI, of ESG, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, environmental, social government, ESG, environmental, social, and government. Like, you have this kind of mentality, this social justice warrior, progressive mentality that really started in the mid 2010s and festered here 2020 to 2024. And there was I think a resoundingly loud and vocal now majority of folks who said, listen, I hear your argument. I hear your messaging. It's not working. I'm not seeing the impact. It's not, what's that word? Effective. So I say all that, Aaron, am I on the right track? Is that what we've seen happen here over the past 5 years, specifically from that post-COVID world?
I think somewhat. So David Brooks actually wrote an op-ed for the New York Times earlier this week or late last week. And he talked about how what we need is an uprising. But when he talks about as an uprising, he's not talking about, Civil War stuff. He's talking about how we need to, we're in a situation that nobody really seems to like. And we need to think about how we got here and then, how we can get out. And one of the things he says in the op-ed that I really resonated with is people on the left need to figure out, or rather need to realize that there's a reason people don't like them very much at the moment. I work in higher ed just like David Brooks does. I love higher ed. I'm also not going to pretend I'm not one of these, right-wing sympathetic, oh, I'm so sorry for being in higher ed and I'm going to crap on where I work. And, actually I'm not one of those. I absolutely refuse to do that. I'm not going to pretend for example, I'm not going to pretend I think Matt Walsh has valid points on mental health. It's like, no, I have a PhD in psychology. He doesn't. End of discussion. So I want to get that out of the way because now that I've said that, David Brooks in the op-ed points out that higher ed, despite all this love we have for it, has really dropped the ball in its role as a leader. It has become very elitist. It tells people who do represent about 50% of the country that they're backwards and wrong and evil. DEI is a complicated topic, but I will say, even as somebody who believes in DEI, the way DEI has been enacted, you look at a lot of DEI practitioners versus DEI theorists. I've had conversations with people and I'll bring up the DEI theory. My boss's boss is a DEI expert and I explain it to them, even some very conservative people. And they're like, that doesn't sound like DEI to me. And I'm like, well, yes, but when the practitioner is somebody who actually doesn't really know what they're talking about and just sees it as an ideological club to beat somebody over the head, it's really rich of me to say, if you only read the theory, you'd know that DEI is good. When it's like, well, the practitioners are doing a really bad idea and they're alienating people who come into higher ed. I think you see that same situation more broadly with the left. AOC and Bernie Sanders are having their rallies all around the country right now. Bernie is passing on his never going to be an effective politician crown to AOC. And now she can begin the long journey of failing to get anything done for the rest of her career, just like he's done. There's talk, David Hogg is vice chair of the Democratic National Convention, and he's advocating for Zoomers to primary other Democrats.
Sure is.
The sheer lack of coherent vision here and connection to reality is a real failure of leadership. And I do think that's what we saw in the last election. I think it was a rejection of higher ed being elitist. And that's why you see a lot of people not really caring what Trump's doing right now with higher ed. I think it was a rejection of a Democratic Party that isn't looking at the center of the country and unironically has people on social media and mainstream media saying, yes, we do think that the two coasts should determine the direction of the country. But at the same time, you used the word mandate, and I don't necessarily know if that's quite what this is. I don't think I think this was a rejection of that version of leadership, but I don't think it was an acceptance of Trump necessarily. And I think we see that with how Trump's numbers have gone as he's doing a lot of the stuff he's been doing over the last 4 months. It's not very effective, as we talked about. And so his poll numbers are plummeting. So I think rather than a whole-scale rejection of the left and an embracing of the right, I think what you're actually seeing is just a desperation among a lot of people to have politicians who can be effective. And they're going, okay, well, Biden hasn't worked for 4 years and they told us he was mentally competent. And that seems to have not been true. So we've been lied to by him. Let's try the other guy again. There was no positive vision put forth by the left in terms of what they actually stood for. So it's just choosing who you hate less. And I think that thirst for an actual coherent vision and an actual way forward and a vision for society, I think that's something still people want. And I think it will be very interesting to see what politicians kind of get that signal and try to move towards that. And I think the anti-Semitism in higher ed issue is itself kind of an example of that, and that there's problems on both sides, but everyone has a hot take and nobody seems to want to actually sit down and do a lot of the difficult thinking about this issue. And what does this actually mean? And how should we actually think about that? And, in the op-ed I wrote that kind of like brought us here today, I wrote this like a month ago at this point. I warned about that. And I was like, higher ed cannot, it cannot just say, oh, when Trump cracks down, that's the right wing, and we have to fight the right wing. And it can't ignore the fact that we got here because of higher ed's leadership in some ways. I think there are actually a lot of good leaders in higher ed, but places like Columbia had a leadership problem. And rather than doing that work and looking inward and playing our role in moving forward with a vision of society where we can, come together and have an actual vision of where we want to go that we talk about and share and debate and refine together, we're just going, nope, Trump bad, which isn't, from my perspective, wrong necessarily, but is so incredibly limited, I'm not sure how useful or effective it's going to be in the long run.
So I want to dig into more of this leadership specifically from the left-wing perspective, because I think this is one thing. I'm not saying you missed it, but I think this is where one of the arguments does get missed, is going back to the example I used before of an organization who embraces Zuberism, right? So when you look at, for example, Columbia, I think you're right that the leadership is absolutely a problem, but it is that leadership who is enabling, right, the mentality to then work its way down towards the actual the grunt employee, right? In this case, the student activist. And it is this mentality that we've seen carry forward over the past 4 or 5 years that has, I think, really turned off a lot of Americans, because it's not just that you have the leadership failings and then the enablement of a lot of folks who would embrace these policies in their extreme, right? To your point, it's not what you're identifying as DEI, but what has become the caricature of DEI, right? Now, this isn't necessarily a conversation or debate about DEI, but rather let's talk about the impacts, the effectiveness, because for your average person, what they've seen, Aaron, and I think this is where the rejection, why I said the word mandate, right, was because they look at what has actually been accomplished from DEI objectively over, and specifically from when it really became pushed over the past 10 years, from, we'll say, 2014 to 2024, right? That decade of the Me Too movement, the DEI movement, the ESG movement, all of these different perspectives were brought to the forefront as the truth, right? The Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, just go through the trans rights, the pride activist movements, all of these entities that you would usually fall under the umbrella of some type of DEI mentality, right? So you see all that, and then we see the impacts, right? Folks looked at the country, and I think objectively speaking said, I feel, and I guess it's hard to say objective feelings, right? But they were saying, I, as a voter or as a citizen of America, I'm looking at where we are objectively saying, I feel that we have gotten worse than we were back when we were embracing the ideas of a true meritocracy, right? When that idea of a meritocracy was not only embraced, but it was promoted and it was taught from leadership. It was embraced by those who were having positions of power. It was embraced by universities. And to see that mentality has really gotten rejected over the years, I think is where a lot of people started to get nervous about embracing this idea just with no questions. And then fast forward to 2024, this was really the first moment, not just to say I'm against this, but I want to vote for a different vision. And there's that one really, really effective ad that Trump had back during the campaign, which was the Kamala Harris, she's for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, right? And that ad was so impactful because it did touch on, there is a group of folks in America who would very much embrace supporting the extreme micro use cases to create this brand new kind of status quo, ground floor, right? Because once you change the status quo, now you can build something further on top of that new status quo. So why I said it was a mandate was not so much to say, hey, we're rejecting the ideas of being a diverse or an equitable society, or inclusive, whatever the terminologies of DEI try to promote. But rather, what we're rejecting is the effectiveness of this policy, because we've seen things get worse. And also, as the different ideas have been implemented into policy, we haven't seen an objective increase in success, or an increase in opportunity, or an increase of diversity. As a matter of fact, we've seen in many cases the opposite. I had Phil Magnus here on the show, and he was talking about, different colleges who not only were talking about like being just like pure DEI schools, but actively rejecting people of the right political persuasion. If they were conservative or Republican, they were proudly saying, we're not going to accept you, or we're not going to hire you, right? So where's the diversity of thought? Why do we have colleges like Harvard with 97% of their staff being one political party? So and I think it's the hypocrisy too, Aaron, that where a lot of folks were like, listen, you're saying you want diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, where's the diversity of thought? Where's the inclusion of folks that you disagree with? Where's the equitable results from folks that maybe don't walk the same path that you do? And they're like, I'm not seeing it. So I think that is more so where that mandate mentality came from, be it accurate or not. I think that's why a lot of folks felt that 2024 election wasn't just a vote for Trump or against Harris, but it was actually a vote against the status quo, or the restructuring of our society to a new status quo. What say you?
I don't think you're. I think you've hit on a lot of important points there. I don't think you're missing it in a lot of ways, and I think you actually, one of the things you bring up is this kind of hijacking of DEI. And I think that's actually something really worth bringing up in terms of this anti-Semitism at Columbia and in broader higher ed. First of all, I'll admit that DEI in higher education, that's a very different story than DEI in business, because the signals are different. It's not the business world. But that being said, some of the examples you mentioned, like Black Lives Matter. Well, there's Black Lives Matter, the movement, and there's Black Lives Matter, the organization. The organization has had people indicted for federal crimes because of misuse of money, but the movement was never really about that necessarily. In fact, I would say it wasn't. I mean, I went to BLM rallies back when I was in grad school in Oklahoma. It was a hilariously conservative crowd in a lot of ways. So now let's take a look at this issue of anti-Semitism, and you have to remember that we're dealing with, in a lot of ways, an active and intentional misrepresentation of DEI language by, and I hate to use this word because it's been hijacked by conspiracy theorists, but it's a psyop. Qatar has how much money in our higher education system? Iran is influencing our higher education system. You have people actively cheering for Hamas and Hezbollah, designated terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. Well, we know that they know how to misuse this language. They did it back in 1979 during the hostage crisis, when the Ayatollah had the black and women and female hostages released, because he knew that would appeal to the American left. We're in a war of ideologies that isn't being fought with bullets, it's being fought with ideas. So there is absolutely a misuse here of DEI that is intentional by Islamists. And I want to make it very clear, I don't mean Muslims, I mean Islamists. Same way I don't mean, when I say Christian, I don't mean Klansman. It's the same basic thing. But Islamic fundamentalism has absolutely been preying on this, and it's kind of an open secret at this point. And I do think you're right. There's a real dislike of the hypocrisy seen in higher ed right now, and that's what I really called out. Is it's like, we can talk about the good that's done in higher ed all we want, and one of the reasons that, for example, the funding freeze of the Ivy Leagues is so damaging is that a lot of good work is done by the Ivy Leagues that funding freeze is going to harm. Like Harvard's health research is incredible. That's using an act. Okay, but let's not pretend we're entirely innocent as a broader higher ed collective here, and that when we're letting people like Mohsen Madawi, a 31-year-old quote unquote undergrad who transfers from Lehigh to Columbia for the activism and gets caught on camera, saying things like intifada, and then trying to say, well, intifada doesn't mean killing the Jews, even though the Intifada was a series of worldwide assassinations. It just means struggle, kind of like the word Kampf. We wouldn't take that from anyone else, but we're somehow taking it because we are so terrified that we're going to get called out for it. It's like, well, of course we're going to get called out for it. They know that we're scared of being called racist, and it's not like this is the West versus Islam either, because there are other nations in the Middle East, like Bahrain, like the United Arab Emirates, saying things like, please stop listening to the Muslim Brotherhood funded voices that you are giving a platform to. It's really bad. We would prefer if you did not do that. But we're not doing that. So we're seeing DEI terms misused and manipulated in higher ed. And then, I think you're right. From the broader perspective across society, what stories are being elevated, who's being given a voice. The perspective is, and I'm not sure it's entirely an accurate one, but it is the perspective and we have to address it. Perspective is that higher ed is itself inherently unfixably corrupt. And then when you add that together with this view of it being elitist, which is not undeserved, and this view of it being anti the common man, ideologically homogenous, which again, not undeserved, as you yourself point out, and people have been sounding the alarm bells for a long time. Well, now Donald Trump represents this chance to get a sort of collective revenge on it. Mm-hmm. And whether we can say that's anti-intellectual, which I think it is, we can say it's unfair. I'd agree. But what do we care about? Are we going to complain about it and say, oh, this is so unfair, this is awful? Or are we going to try to be effective? Mm-hmm. And right now, I would say there's kind of like in the op-ed I was talking about from David Brooks. Yeah, and in the short term, there are going to need to be short-term goals like stopping Trump's unconstitutional attacks on Harvard. I don't have any sympathy for Harvard in some ways, but the way he's doing it isn't following the process of law. At least that is the argument. The courts will bear that out. But in the long term, it's like we need to address the fact that most Americans, or at least certainly a lot of Americans, don't think of us as providing value. And so we need to try to do that. That's one of the things I really love about where I work and what I get to do and what my institution, Rice University, gets to do is we're plugged into Houston. People like Rice in Houston. It's not for the sports. We are not a sports school. We have U of H for that. But Rice is liked because Rice invests back in its city. We work with the community. We try to provide and show that value, not in a look at me, look at me, look at me kind of way, but in a genuine, we want to help kind of way. And I'm not saying this because I'm trying to kiss up to my job. That's why I like my job and why I've stayed here and why I want to stay here and why I like what I do, is because that's what I think higher ed should be. And there are plenty of schools that do that. And that's why I said, I don't think it's an accurate picture. I think if you look at a lot of schools, especially smaller communities, but also even big cities, I mean, Houston's just beat Chicago now for third in America. We give back to the community. We're trying to fight that narrative that we don't care. But the Ivy Leagues, I'm not sure, have really done that. And they could do it. They really could. I mean, look at the cancer research that comes out of Harvard. That could be so impactful. That is impactful. But what we're allowing, and by the way, I mean broader higher ed again, is instead we're allowing this vision of what we do to be broadcast by a bunch of 18 to 20-year-olds setting stuff on fire and then not getting punished for it. And, when you hit somebody's justice or unfairness button, psychologically speaking, not that there's no psychological term called the fairness button, but, let's just go with it. That's a really powerful motivator. People don't like what they see as unfair. People don't like what they perceive as injustice. And the idea that a bunch of white, keffia-clad, conspiracy-driven kids, unintentional alliteration, that they get to set Columbia on fire and then get called activists, that's going to strike a lot of people as unfair. It strikes me as unfair, but I'm Jewish. So, I don't like my safety being threatened by a bunch of people chanting Intifada, and I don't like the idea that, that left-wing QAnon is getting a lot of sympathy. But it's also going to tick off people who aren't even in this at all. And they're going, how much money are these kids having spent on them? And this is what they're doing with it. And yeah, is that a minority of students? Probably. Is that describing the everyday experience? Probably not. Most students are probably just trying to do their jobs and work and get a degree. But, the leadership just allowed that to become the optics. They allowed that to be what was displayed because they didn't shut it down. And here we are.
I think the other piece, Aaron,
we can either.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I think the other piece is that not only did leadership not shut it down, but that there was a fear from other voices from the grassroots who would want to speak out against this mentality. But they were ostracized. You're called a bad person if you didn't toe the line. Your social circles were destroyed. I experienced this during COVID because I didn't toe the line with the trust the experts mentality. And I had some very, very close friends, gentlemen who were in my wedding who I haven't really talked to in 4 or 5 years because they still view me as a threat to society because I didn't take the public health expert recommendations seriously. And the fact that I know from my microcosm, right? Like that was very, it was tough for me to get through. And yet I know that I am just an example of what many other folks have experienced over the past 10 years, where it's not just I disagree with you, but it's I disagree with you and you're a bad person. And this mentality then being embraced, not just by the collective in these institutions of higher education, but being enabled, to your point, from the leadership. And I'm going to say, I think the reason that it was enabled, Aaron, and I want to, as we go towards the tail end of the conversation here, I want this, to maybe be woven into your final thoughts, is we keep on using the word effective to outline, what we should consider to be good policy or good practices going forward. I would say that the leadership, they thought they were being effective, right? They thought that we were able to mobilize a very loud, vocal group of activists to not just promote a narrative that it more aligns with our worldview, but also that this narrative that was being embraced was so emotionally charged that it gave the folks who were echoing it the power in their mind to shame others, to tell you to shut down and sit up, or sit down and shut up. There we go. Shut down and sit up. Yeah. Sit down and shut up. But also, if you do speak out against me, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to make sure you understand that you're a bad person. I'm going to tell other people that you're a bad person. You're dangerous. Your views are a threat to society. You're against public health. You're against public justice. All these different narratives that were promoted. And it really did fracture not just the trust in leadership, but it fractured the trust in each other. And that's where I think, for my final thoughts today is that effectiveness 1000% matters, but the effectiveness has to be judged in an objective manner, right? And I think what we've seen happen over the past, especially 10 years, is that effectiveness has been, instead of being objective, it's been labeled in the eye of the beholder. So a lot of folks in the left, they have been effective in their perspective, right? BLM was very effective. DEI was very effective. ESG was very effective. Why? Because we were able to move people in positions of societal or economic power or something therein to do things and promote policies the way we wanted them to be done. And we did that for 10 years pretty much with very little opposition. And if we did have opposition, guess what we did? We censored them. We screamed them down. If you were on social media echoing that was anything anti whatever the narrative was, COVID especially, you not just only got shouted down, maybe you got your platforms banned, right? Stuff like that started to happen. And I think what happened was over that 10-year period, folks just started to say, that's it, I'm done, I'm out, right? And to your point, not necessarily going back to something of substance to build upon, but now being that swing back, that the punch, the counter punch back, that's where we are right now. I want to see a society that is built on not just effectiveness, but objective effectiveness, right? I want to see our communities get better. I want to see our roads and our infrastructure get repaired. I want to see our kids not struggling to have basic reading skills at the 4th grade and see that 97% of kids in a school district like in Illinois can't read at that level. I want to see parents who have been saving up, for decades at this point to be able to retire and not feel they have to work until literally the day they die. I want to see kids be able to go and get an education without feeling they're going to go to school as, just a normal, person and come out an indoctrinated little zombie, right? Like these are all things that I think we can absolutely look at as objective good, but we just need to plant our flag and say, listen, goofballs on the left and goofballs on the right, y'all been screaming at each other for years at this point. Here's where the common sense, like the objective reality of society actually exists. And now we need that objective reality society to speak up. Because if we don't, then it's just going to continue to be the loudest voices who are going to get the attention. It's going to be those squeakiest wheels who get the grease. So that's my final thoughts for today. Aaron, bring us home. What are your final thoughts? And I guess before we wrap up today, please do us a favor. Make sure you tell folks where they can go ahead and follow you if they want to continue the conversation today.
Sure. So I think you're right in that there has been a series of angry decisions and angry ways of thinking on both sides of the aisle. You called it the swing back, but like the right became the left, arguably, in a lot of ways. It was about shutting people down. Well, now that's what the right's doing. I think I've lost more friends from the right wing than the left wing in the last couple of years, because I don't agree. I don't hold to the orthodoxy on some or other point. I think what has to happen, you're right, we have to come together and we have to have an objective idea of effectiveness. But before we do that, we have to have a shared vision for what we want. And it has to be a realistic one. It has to be an achievable one. And it has to be an objective and concrete one. So this phrase has been poisoned for the rest of time. But the idea of make America great again. It's like, what does great mean? What does great mean? A lot of people now who feel they're in the middle are feeling disenfranchised. That's the biggest winner of the 2024 election was nobody, because a lot of people stay home. And that disengagement is being driven farther and farther. So when you want to have discussions about this stuff and you want to set the social agenda, I think there's a real feeling of powerlessness, because we don't have name your social media form. And a lot of people don't have thousands upon millions of viewers. So I think the way this starts, whether on the issue of anti-Semitism or on the issue of anything else, the way this starts is in your own backyard and your own local bar and wherever you meet people and you talk to them. And it starts with you. You have to be a leader. It doesn't matter what institutional power you have. It matters what particular skills you have, and do you want to use influence. And not power, but influence, to not only change other people's minds, but learn and grow yourself. And I think that's going to be something that's not something that can happen top down. That's going to be about having conversations across the aisle and not listening when people get mad at you for doing it. Whether it's people getting mad at Pete Buttigieg for going on to, right-wing comedians podcasts, or I don't know what the left-wing version would be, but I know they exist,
it's called the evening news, Aaron. Sorry.
Oh, whatever, how dare you talk to people across the aisle? Well, I want a vision of America, and we have to talk to each other before we can even set what that vision looks like and decide how we're going to get there and set those standards, right? We need to have a clear set of objectives. And I think that's itself going to be a process that takes a lot of time. So I think this is a conversation that's going to continue for a lot of people. I think it's a process that's going to be long and involved, and then sometimes painful, but it has to happen, because right now we're way too fractured. And when you see these opinion polls, like the majority of Americans support Israel, the majority of Americans hate anti-Semitism. Why does that not appear to be our reality? Because we're listening to these loud little voices on social media, and not the people talking to the people around us. And that feels so trite to say that, just go talk to people. But it is, especially since COVID. We've become so isolated. So the way to recapture the middle, the way to have a sane step and path forward, it's not a political rally. It's not an award-winning TikTok. It's finding third space, finding the people there, and when that you all disagree with each other, trying to find common ground and a way forward at your local level, and then hopefully that can spread broader. So that feels very trite and not particularly, that's not my Braveheart speech in a lot of ways. But I think that, real leadership is an everyday thing. It's not a grandiose, big moment. Sometimes it's just those little things. So that's I think my final thought. So.
Amen. No, and by the way, to bring us home, I think the last thing I'll say for today's episode is there was one of those TikTok reels or whatever, and it was showing a progression of where people would meet new friends over like a 60-year period. And it went from people meeting friends at work or at the park or at a social club, like a Moose Lodge or Knights of Columbus, something like that. Any of these areas where you'd meet new people and then congregate, right? And you see the percentages are all pretty even within like the 15 to 20% for each one. And then all of a sudden, 1987, I think it was, this little thing comes out called the internet. And then all of a sudden, you just see the internet go all the way up to like 40% of where people find their community. I'm just going to tell you, folks, here's an action item for today. Get off the internet and go outside. Like, go talk to real people. Before our show today, I was downtown walking through and talking to folks at the farmers market, right? Like, go get involved. Go be present in real life. Build those relationships. And oh, by the way, it gives you more of a chance to, lead in your community where you can have the most impact. So yeah, there's a call to action for today. If we can take some, very big positives away, it is that don't feel helpless. Don't feel that you're just like watching this, one side versus the other side have a screaming match. No, understand that you can actually have a very real impact and making things better. And it starts right in your backyard, in your local communities. With that being said, Aaron, where can folks go ahead and find you if they want to continue this conversation? Email, social media, floor is yours.
So actually, and it's funny that you mentioned, the getting off the internet. I don't actually do much social media for that reason.
All right.
But you can certainly see what I write on the Young Voices. What are we calling it now? X, Musk, Twitter, whatever you want to. If you follow Young Voices on social media, you can absolutely whenever I publish stuff as a Young Voices writer, they republish it, and yeah, that would be a great way to stay in touch with what I do. And
there we go. Good stuff. I'll include those links there, Aaron, in the show notes. Folks, I hope you've gotten some value from today's conversation. Who am I kidding? I know you got some value from today's conversation. So I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Please go ahead and give it a share. When you do, please tag yours truly at B Nichols Liberty on Facebook, on X, or on Instagram. Also, the Brian Nichols Show is, yes, a video and podcast show. So if you like your video content, head over to YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X is where we go ahead and air the video version of the show. Also, we air the show live on Mondays and Fridays at 9 p.m. Eastern. So go ahead, check those out when they go live. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do so over on X, Facebook, and Rumble, where the show will go live. YouTube and podcast version usually air around 10 p.m. or so after the live version goes there for the first hour. And then as for, yes, the podcast version, if you like to take your shows on the road like I do, head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, wherever it is you consume your podcast content. I like Podcast Addict. Hit subscribe to the Brian Nichols Show. And if you really want to get your feet wet in terms of what are we talking about today? Brian's mentioned a lot of sales and marketing stuff. Yeah, we talk about that quite a bit in detail in some of those past episodes, specifically how to message, articulate your ideas, but also to, most importantly, meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Hit download all unplayed episodes. We have over 960 plus episodes in the archives, which, by the way, is the only place you can find all 960 plus episodes of the show, because elephant in the room, some of those YouTubers and stuff, they didn't like our content when it was during COVID. So they hit us with some strikes. So we had to remove some stuff. So don't worry, though. We still have all those episodes available over at the podcast or at briannicholsshow.com. Email me, brian@briannicholsshow.com. And also, please support our phenomenal sponsors like Blood of Tyrants, Evil's CBD, Liquid Freedom Energy Tea, and of course, our phenomenal studio sponsor, Cardio Miracle, the best heart health supplement in the world. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up there. Thank you for joining us. And with that being said, Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show for Aaron Pomerantz. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.